So for more on all of this, let's bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab. He is now in Imtiaz, you're in southern Israel. So give us the latest on the ground there today. Are even more airstrikes and rocket attacks expected?
Anne-Marie, Vlad, good to talk to you. Yeah, those airstrikes inside of Gaza have been continuing overnight and all morning. And here in Beersheba, there's been a series of rocket strikes. In fact, we just had to run into that shelter behind me. I'm not sure if you can see it, after a number of rockets were fired over this town. And this city, which is sort of in the Negev, it's east of the Gaza Strip, so not very far. And while we were in that shelter behind me, we could hear loud bang after bang after bang as Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system intercepted those rockets. And although while we were in that shelter, we could of course see people crying, people comforting each other. It's certainly very terrifying for people who live here. Of course, in Gaza, the situation is very different. There's no proportionality whatsoever to what people there are experiencing. There are no shelters in Gaza. There's nowhere to hide. And yet the airstrikes continue, the bombings continue, and so too does the devastation. Anne-Marie, Vlad.
Imtiaz, we've learned Israeli forces have tried and they have failed to kill Hamas's chief military commander. Give us some details into that. It's remarkable that this is something that they've been attempting to do for some time, I'm guessing.
Yeah, for the better part of 20 years, they've been trying to kill Mohammed Deif, who's a senior commander of the Qassam Brigades. And the Qassam Brigades is basically the armed faction of Hamas. Hamas will say that they're just a government, they're just a leader. Of course, it's very different. Much of the world views Hamas as a terrorist organization, but Hamas will tell you that we run governments, we run the ministry. Regardless, the Qassam Brigades is their armed wing, and Mohammed Deif is the very tippy top of that. And Israel has been trying to kill him for many, many years, have made several attempts. In fact, if you read his biography, for lack of a better phrase, he's lost 2 legs, he's lost an arm and an eye, but he has not lost his life. And Israel is still continuing to target him. We understand that his house was destroyed in the Khan Yunis neighborhood of the Gaza Strip, which is just at the very north of the Gaza Strip. So Israel very determined to get a scalp, for lack of a better phrase. And some believe that that's why this fighting continues, that at this stage, Israel doesn't have a big target that they can say, we got this guy, we're good. So again, a lot of concern that although there's attempts to get a ceasefire going, that until they get somebody big, that the fighting could continue.
Imtiaz, you mentioned proportionality, and sort of the reality of this conflict is that many more Palestinians are dying than Israelis, and there are many more children that are Palestinian children that are dying. Israel says that Hamas is using human shields, and that is why there are so many innocent people being killed in these airstrikes in Gaza. But what is Israel doing to prevent even more civilian deaths?
Yeah, look, Israel says its strikes are surgical, but all we have to do is look at our TV screens and know that that is not surgical. They're leveling entire buildings, flattening neighborhoods. There's nothing surgical about the kind of devastation. But Israel does do, and it has in a number of its strikes, where especially in populated areas, is that it will call people or play messages to people, or even send them text messages saying that they are going to be bombing them and giving them usually a few minutes to get out of where they are. Not an awful lot of time to leave your house that you have all your belongings to, all your memories, and find somewhere to go before that building is reduced to rubble. But you're right, the death toll in the Gaza Strip is very high. It's racing towards 250. Many of those, of course, are children, and that is really the sad tragedy of what happens in Gaza. Is all too often it's innocent people. Now, interestingly, we've been speaking to children on both sides. We spoke to a 10-year-old girl inside of Gaza who tells us that she has hopes and dreams and doesn't feel that she can have any of those hopes and dreams because of the state of Gaza. But we've also spoken to a 10-year-old girl here in Israel, and she says all she wants to see is peace. She lives very, very close to Gaza in a community near the south of Israel. And I asked her if you could meet that girl in Gaza who says she has no hope, who fears for her future, what would you say to her? What would you do? And she said, I'd hug her. Anne-Marie, Vlad.
Imtiaz, what's the latest on the ceasefire talks? We know countries like Egypt, Qatar, Jordan, and France are trying to lead those efforts right now. And we talked about this earlier this week, Imtiaz, as to the end goal. I mean, even if there is a ceasefire, describe to our viewers what life will be like for people left in Gaza who, as we all know, is blockaded. They can't use the sea. The sea is blockaded, and they obviously can't go into Israel or to Egypt. Because, you know, the one thing that is troublesome is now the rest of the world is starting to take a closer look at what is happening there, which could be troublesome for the state of Israel. And at the end of the day, they're certainly not going to engender any goodwill from the people in Gaza or the people in the West Bank. And, you know, the Israelis certainly have to be thinking about that, because there's now language, specifically in Washington, D.C. and in other countries, that are attempting to label Israel as an apartheid state. And so that's got to be worrisome for them. They don't want to be perceived as that, because that could create problems in the future for that democracy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, you know, when you look at groups like Human Rights Watch, you know, U.S.-based human rights organization, just this year, before this conflict, put out a very long and detailed report where it accused or called Israel an apartheid state. B'Tselem, one of the most well-known human rights organizations in Israel, Israelis work in it, have also put out a report calling Israel an apartheid state. It's coming from without and it's coming from within. Now, for the Israeli government, they're, of course, concerned about that. They are very active against what's known as the BDS movement, which is basically a divestment and sanctions initiative and a boycott initiative against Israel. They work really hard to prevent any of these initiatives ever happening. And so they're very, very conscious of how they are perceived in the world, with, of course, their allies, but indeed around the world. And so, yes, it is a concern and always is a concern. And anything Israel can do to bat back any criticisms of its actions will certainly be met with a lot of force. But, you know, Vlad, you've covered this story, I've covered this story, and one thing Israel often deals with is internal politics, domestic politics, and that really defines so much of what the world sees. And the world may see Israel in a lot of ways, but the reasons behind what a lot of Israel does is because of those domestic politics. And very quickly, we need to acknowledge the fact that Israel is in a political crisis. For 2 years now, they've had 4 successive elections and no conclusive result. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been the leader of this country for a very long time, is only the caretaker prime minister. Other political leader has been asked to try to form a government. Now, whether he achieves that in the next few weeks or not, only time will tell. But the reality is you have this conflict, you have the West Bank, you have all this issue inside of Israel with intercommunal fighting, you have East Jerusalem. There's so many issues, and of course all this pressure to get a ceasefire from Jordan, from Egypt, from Qatar, from the US, from the United Nations, from the European Union. Israel is facing so many things on so many fronts, and yet it always often boils down to its own domestic considerations. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he is a fighter, he is a survivor, and many see him as using this conflict, using this tension to try to bolster his credentials as Mr. Security, Mr. Tough, who's going to keep Israel safe. And some fear that even though we understand that Hamas does want a ceasefire, that he may refuse one because it could be in his own political interests. Anne-Marie, Vlad.
Imtiaz Tyab reporting on the ground for us with some very eye-opening details. Imtiaz, thank you very much.